All war conflicts are hell, but there was one that literally had it at its feet. We are talking about the Vietnam War, in which explosive mines on the battlefield ground claimed the lives of thousands of American soldiers in a bloody and relentless manner. These devices were one of the Vietnamese secret weapons to win the war. The eastern jungle was already naturally hostile, and with the distribution of these hidden deadly mechanisms throughout the terrain, it was only a matter of time before the lives of American soldiers were taken one by one. In today's video, we will determine the types of traps and strategies used by the Viet Cong and delve into the consequences for the soldiers. Get ready for a journey into a hostile jungle, and be very careful where you step in this new and dangerous installment of military history. In the 1960s, in the heart of Southeast Asia, a conflict erupted that would mark a generation and change the history of Americans and Vietnamese. The Vietnam War, a battle between two opposing ideologies, materialized into an armed conflict of extraordinary dimensions, left deep scars on the land where it happened and in the hearts of those who lived through it. Amidst the lush Vietnamese jungle, the war took a brutal turn. American forces found themselves fighting not only against a fierce adversary, but also an invisible one, camouflaged among the foliage and willing to employ tactics that defied all convention. Contrary to popular belief that the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong were inferior to U.S. forces in skill and firepower, the reality is that their deadly ingenuity and creative tactics made them equally lethal. The jungles of Vietnam became a treacherous stage for locals and foreigners alike. Every step was a deadly gamble, where the price was life itself. Every shadow could conceal the threat of an ambush. And in this setting, explosive traps emerged, nothing less than deadly puzzles created to sow chaos and casualties among enemy ranks. Deadly devices hidden beneath dense vegetation, these explosive traps became the weapon of choice for those fighting from their impenetrable hideouts. From simple landmines to complex traps with sharp spikes and deadly poisons, the territory dominated by the Viet Cong became a lethal and unpredictable minefield. Each trek among the trees, mosquitoes, and unbearable heat was a test of resilience, not just physical but also mental. The roar of artillery, the crunch of branches underfoot, and the constant threat of explosive traps created an environment where survival depended on cunning and inner strength, qualities not all soldiers possessed. It's worth noting that not all American fighters were seasoned troops. Many were young individuals with basic training sent to fight out of obligation, and they found themselves terrified amidst engagements with Vietnam's rebel forces.
You got your squad and tie in to the left.
For these reasons, while soldiers fought on the front lines, the war also raged in the homes and streets of America. The Vietnam War divided opinions, sparking protests and questioning the morality and justification of military intervention. As the war dragged on, the emotional toll and loss of lives led to a shift in perspective in American society and the pressure it exerted on government authorities. The withdrawal of U.S. troops marked the end of an era, but the aftermath of the war persisted, both in Southeast Asia and in the global consciousness. One of the most serious consequences of the conflict was the maiming caused by the monstrous traps of the Vietnamese. Let's explore a bit the design of these devices and why they were so effective and deadly. In the dark theater of war, military traps can become deadly shadows, designed to trigger tragedy with a simple oversight. Imagine a scenario where every step you take could be your last. That was Vietnam War. The jungle was plagued with these ingenious and lethal devices that caused death by exploiting the most natural human behaviors: habit, self-preservation, curiosity, or even greed. In the green eastern expanses, deadly spikes, explosive bombs, and sinister metal traps awaited the carelessness or self-preservation instinct of soldiers. For example, when attacked by gunfire, combatants would hit the ground or run, only to be killed by cleverly hidden traps. Mastery in placing these mechanisms lies in offering seemingly simple solutions to problems that can arise in any armed confrontation. An open door in a seemingly safe building could be a refuge when a squad is ambushed by enemy fire. The problem is that it's likely a decoy leading directly to a deadly trap. This is where military technology comes into play. Devices like the versatile and lethal M142 or the Yugoslav UMNO P1, designed to trigger explosives in various ways, from trap wires to direct pressure or tension release. Most of these mines contain between 250 grams and 1 kilogram of explosives, enough to end one or several lives in an instant. Their action radius, sometimes as small as 1 meter, made them indiscriminate weapons, unleashing chaos and suffering impersonally and without any remorse. But the price to pay was high, as the traps did not discriminate against their victims. They affected civilians and non-combatants, leaving scars that lasted long after the conflict. It even led to unfortunate instances of friendly fire. The use against civilians was prohibited by international laws, which sought to discourage their use. But in the harsh reality of the battlefield, these traps claimed the lives of thousands of people. The Viet Cong had a variety as sinister as it was spectacular of these artifacts. Some were strictly designed for effectiveness, while others were designed sadistically to generate pain and fear in enemy troops. These ingenious and deadly creations were designed to lurk and surprise, taking the conflict to new levels of terror. Let's look at some of the most outstanding and chilling models of Vietnamese deadly mines.
One individual being injured takes out 2 other people at one time. But everyone else in that squad is going to have to take their turn of carrying this individual and his equipment. So you've limited their combat effectiveness right off the bat. So if you can get 1 or 2 or even 3 people injured in that squad, then you've either limited or destroyed their combat effectiveness. That unit is no longer viable.
Deadly dance of the bamboo whip. In the dense Vietnamese jungles, the Viet Cong unleashed its fury with explosive traps of the bamboo whip. The enemy camouflaged clever devices made with elastic bamboo sticks, armed with sharp plates and connected to trap wires. When the trap was triggered, the sharp end would violently rotate, reaching the legs and torsos, piercing the chest and limbs of unsuspecting soldiers. A macabre ballet that left indelible scars on those who dared to cross its lethal path if it didn't take their lives.
This is a pivoting leg trap. You've got a stepping plate here. This right here is the pivot, and on this end, the punji stakes. Be covered over with a lattice work and, of course, camouflaged. As you walk by, someone steps into the trap. Their own body weight powers the trap, pushing it up and striking them.
The stealth of death, mudball mines. The insidious mudball mines hid their true power under a layer of mud or clay, baked in the sun. With M26 and M33 grenades at their core, the Viet Cong removed the safety of the hand grenade and concealed it in a deceptive shell, a fragile casing just a few centimeters thick. When stepped on, the mud hideout would break, releasing a deadly explosion. A perfect camouflage that kept soldiers constantly at risk, even in seemingly harmless terrain. Shots from the shadows, cartridge explosive traps. In a sinister twist, cartridge explosive traps replaced the classic explosion with a precise shot. Made with simple components available in any Vietnamese barracks, these modified landmines used a small bamboo tube, a nail, wood, and ammunition, usually a rifle assault bullet. When the trap was stepped on, the primer struck the nail, firing the projectile directly at the intruder's foot. This lethal fusion of ingenuity and brutality could injure American soldiers, or, depending on the victim's position relative to the shot, end their life. The hidden horror in the grass, punji sticks. Vietnamese fighters wove their malevolent web of stakes, often impregnated with infectious substances like spider or snake venom, throughout the territory. They dug holes, concealed the spikes, and covered the ensemble with a subtle layer of grass. Beneath the apparent calm of the vegetation, punji sticks awaited their chance to unleash terror among the Americans. Sharpened bamboo stakes hidden in buried boxes or camouflaged with grass became deadly traps. Whether in improvised ambushes or under false bridges, these cunning ploys left soldiers exposed to invisible and ruthless danger. The victim, upon crossing the cover, fell directly onto the spikes, with no chance of avoiding the tragedy. While many of the injuries they caused were not necessarily fatal, in the context of warfare in the middle of the jungle, it could render troops defenseless against an enemy offensive or a slow and painful death from a wound infection. In other instances, the ploys were much more savage and disgusting.
One of the more effective ways this was used was after this would be shaped, is that it would be filled with human excrement. And that way anyone who fell on this would also have the human excrement imparted into the wound and just starts horrendous infection.
Snake pits, deadly deception in the jungle. The wildest and boldest Viet Cong guerrillas carried handfuls of poisonous snakes to sow chaos. They tied these deadly creatures to a bamboo cane and hid them in complex tunnels that traversed the jungle's internal paths. This bamboo cane was hidden in the ground as bait and was kicked by unsuspecting victims who walked cautiously and desperately, looking at the horizon and the trees in search of enemies but forgetting to look down. Upon kicking the bamboo lattice, the snakes would launch themselves, attacking the enemy. These vermin were known as three-step snakes because that was the distance a bitten soldier could cover before the venom claimed their life. Ambushes in the air, anti-helicopter traps. Even in the skies, American soldiers found no safe haven. Huey helicopters, used to insert troops and evacuate the wounded, were the target of ingenious anti-helicopter traps. Grenades, projectiles, and explosives waited among the trees, activated by trap wires. A chilling reminder that war in Vietnam knew no bounds, not even in the heights. Flag bombs, hidden danger and war standards. The National Vietnamese Navy and the Viet Cong exploited the American desire to capture enemy flags. Americans believed in cultural battle and wanted to eliminate any trace of the enemy, which would ultimately become a weakness that caused countless casualties. The Easterners, aware of the enemy troops' desire, placed explosives in the flags that were triggered upon being touched. Any attempt to move the flagpole or the flag detonated the charge, turning the act of symbolic victory into certain death. The mace, the hammer of destiny. The mace, considered the most terrifying and gruesome trap in the entire Vietnamese arsenal, seemed to come straight out of the most twisted of cartoons. Its premise was as simple as it was brutal. When a victim tripped over the metal cable that activated the mechanism, it released a 20-kilogram metal or wooden ball filled with spikes hanging from a tree, causing a death as automatic as it was horrific to whoever was underneath the device. The most terrible part was when soldiers found the mangled bodies of their comrades who had suffered the consequences of this macabre engineering device.
Always available, gravity generates velocity. When a spiked bamboo trap is pulled high in the air, it accelerates towards the ground when released. Velocity plus mass plus sharpened spikes equals death from above.
There was a variation of this trap called the tiger trap, which instead of dropping a deadly spiked ball, involved being crushed by bricks and poisoned metal darts. Both deaths were equally unbearable and desperate. As mentioned earlier, while the goal of these mines was to eliminate the enemy, they sometimes did not achieve their objective 100%, leaving the lives and bodies of some soldiers torn forever. Let's talk a little about the devastating legacy of the traps of the Vietnam War. In the scorching August of 1970, Gordon S. Wise, a 20-year-old soldier from Minneapolis, lay in his hospital bed in Chu Lai, Vietnam. From that place, he whispered for them to write one last letter to his family, a farewell echoing with the tragedy's resonance. Just 2 days after his emotional message, Wise departed from this world, having fallen victim to one of the deadly anti-personnel mines that infested the Vietnamese landscape. The conflict in Vietnam went beyond the conventional narrative of war, earning the title of the War of Mines and Explosive Traps for military strategy specialists. The Viet Cong, aware of their inferiority in firepower, unleashed a deadly arsenal of mines and traps, transforming the terrain into an unpredictable battlefield. This strategy basically consisted of leveraging knowledge of the territory and the hostility of the environment to automatically disadvantage the Americans, reversing the scenario. Something akin to the Battle of Thermopylae waged by the Spartans. The first American soldier to succumb in Vietnam fell victim to an anti-personnel mine, almost like an omen, marking the beginning of a ruthless struggle against the unseen. In 1967, a U.S. Army officer reflected in his war diary, "The biggest problem in facing the enemy in Vietnam is not being able to find them to fight them." This statement encapsulated the harsh reality. Mines became invisible enemies, challenging detection and sowing fear at every step. U.S. troops, helpless against this hidden threat, suffered significant losses due to ineffective mine detection techniques, which often ended in troop deaths. Mines, mostly locally homemade, surpassed the counterattack system's ability to detect and destroy them. The Viet Cong, in a bold move, detected American traps and even dared to reuse them against the forces that deployed them. The cruel irony is found in a report containing a Pentagon confession, determining that the enemy relied heavily on American mines to inflict harm. Statistics paint a bleak retrospective picture. In Vietnam, landmines accounted for more than a third of all American casualties. Facing a cunning and unpredictable enemy led to setbacks, disruptions in plans, and disorder in U.S. ranks, so it can be inferred that war tactics based on hidden mines were one of the keys to America's loss in the war. The testimonies of various soldiers reflect the palpable fear that the mines instilled, disrupting American strategies. Despite superiors' efforts to persuade troops that mines could be an advantage since they showed that the enemy feared close combat, the reality was a constant fear of the invisible about to constantly erupt.
United States of America, after each of you, well and faithfully served our great nation.
These traps, woven with ingenuity and desperation, reveal the darkest side of the confrontation between the Viet Cong and the United States, where the confrontation went beyond bullets, delving into the terrifying realm of stealthy murder engineering. Thus, in the treacherous jungle, every step of the United States soldiers was marked by the shadow of death, manifested in these terrifying bloodthirsty mines that defined the brutality of the Vietnam War. The land, once marked by these invisible traps, will forever remember the brutal price of a war where each step could be the last. In this way, we are reaching the end of today's video, but before we finish, we wanted to ask you, do you think the Viet Cong won the war thanks to these deadly trap artifacts? We look forward to your response in the comments section below. We thank you for staying until the end, and we await you in the upcoming installments of Military History.